Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is C.B. Robertson, this is episode 36, and today, per request, we are going to be talking about shooting and consciousness. No, we're not going to be talking about the hard problem of consciousness that is still a mystery, maybe always will be. We will have to see. But we can discuss the origins of consciousness. Now, the nature of this question is such that it's probably always going to be somewhat speculative. I was in the camp that evolutionary psychology was not real science for a while. I think I've been corrected on that. GADSAD has said that there actually have been falsified theories. And if you can have a falsified theory, so far as I'm concerned, it's a science. But it is a softer science in that it's very hard to do, controlled tests and things like that. When we are trying to figure out what happened retrospectively without, necessarily a lot of evidence. This is not like archaeology where we can find physical artifacts. We're speculating about the nature of mushy brains that don't stay around for 30,000, 50,000 years. It's all speculative, but we can still come up with ideas and see what's useful. And I think the utility of talking about consciousness in terms of shooting has to do with the usefulness of that theory and a different way of thinking about consciousness than we're used to thinking about. Now, my wife and I actually sort of came together and began speaking with each other over what has become a fairly famous book now, called The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian and Jaynes. It was an absolutely brilliant book written back in the 70s that combines neuroscience and ancient literature analysis, specifically from the Iliad and Gilgamesh and similar works, to create a hypothesis about the origins of consciousness that argued that humans were essentially schizophrenic zombies back in the day who wandered around hearing the sound of their own thoughts as external vocalizations. So that their own thoughts would appear to them as auditory hallucinations, perhaps the voice of a god or a dead friend or, something to that effect. And were interpreted this way. And Jaynes gives brain hemispherical reasons for why that is. Broca's and Wernicke's areas on one side of the brain, then on the other side of the brain there's these sort of mystery organs that we weren't sure what they do, and he offers a hypothesis. My summary here is necessarily terse because it's been not quite a decade, but a long time since I've read it. And other people can probably summarize it better than me. But Jaynes's theory is one of many theories about the origins of consciousness. And how did we come to be, and by conscious we don't mean the possession of a subjective experience, but rather the possession of self-awareness. How did that arise? And if we can understand how it came to be, does that tell us something about its purpose and its significance? Or now that we have it, is it significant for reasons that have nothing to do with its origins? So I want to, for the purpose of exploring this question, and for the record here, I absolutely love Jaynes. I love his book. I think he's a brilliant writer and theorist. I am skeptical of his theory. And I'm even more skeptical of the next most popular theory about the origins of consciousness, which has become popular recently. It's kind of an emergentism from complexity. This is very popular among Silicon Valley types and engineers. I think that if you just have a system that's sufficiently complex, consciousness, subjective experience will just naturally emerge out of the complexity. And the brain is an extraordinarily complex system, so we can have high levels of consciousness out of that. It doesn't seem to explain anything to me. It's like a false because. And then there's another popular one among Joe Rogan aficionados, the so-called stoned ape theory. And I've actually been reading a little bit about a alternative version of that called the snake bite theory, which is similar to the stoned ape theory, but it's snake venom specifically. And once you get one person who experiences self-awareness, recognizing themselves, then they can communicate that, and it can spread like a virus among the rest of the human population with sufficient communication skills. And then there's another theory I've been meaning to read called the Eve theory that explains for a variety of converging social and genetic reasons that consciousness began in women and then spread, to the rest of society from there, and this resulted in agriculture or something. I still have to read that. But this podcast is not about any of those theories. I just wanted to put out that there are a lot of other theories. This is about a theory that was recently put forward by Ed Hamann and I. We published it on Jack Donovan's page, Pater, a kind of webzine advancing solar culture, and it's called The Aim of Agency, Shooting as an Origin of Consciousness. And my plan is to just read this essay, sort of a low-effort podcast today, but it might be of interest, and I'll add in some commentary, sort of explaining some of these points, and some additional background that we didn't include, and possible inferences and conclusions that we might draw from this. So, without further ado, I will read this, and I'll include a link to this essay, as well as some of the other stuff I've been looking into relating to origins of consciousness and competing theories for people who want to read those. So, The Aim of Agency, Shooting as an Origin of Consciousness. Quote, "You have become a different person in the course of these years, for this is what the art of archery means, a profound and far-reaching contest of the archer with himself. Perhaps you have hardly noticed it yet, but you will feel it very strongly when you meet your friends and acquaintances again in your own country. Things will no longer harmonize as before. You will see with other eyes and measure with other measures. It has happened to me, too, and it will happen to all who are touched by the spirit of this art." Eugene Herrigel, Zen and the Art of Archery, 1953. Homo sapiens, the shooting hominid. We've all heard stories about amazing shots. Usually these stories star sharpshooters, on screen or on the battlefield, calmly and precisely taking down a target at a seemingly impossible distance. This might be Quigley hitting a bucket while standing at 782 yards, or Chris Kyle killing an enemy sniper at 2,100 yards. Something about these stories captivates us, and we tell them over and over again with different men behind the trigger. Not just John Russell, Bob Lee Swagger, and the Gunslinger, but back to Robin Hood splitting an arrow, or Odysseus threading the axe heads with his heavy bow. Hitting the target at a distance is an act of primordial importance, to the point of species defining. Our gifts that helped us thrive in the distant past were extraordinary endurance, surpassing even wolves and horses, an immensely complex vocal range, which permitted more precise communication, and the ability to hit things from a distance with force and accuracy, initially by throwing and later by launching with bows and guns. Combined, these three skills, endurance, communication, and launching projectiles, made humans the deadliest predators on the planet. Today, nothing stops us from developing our endurance, even if this once universal virtue is no longer as evenly distributed as it once was. Endurance seems to have simultaneously increased and decreased. The average American will get winded by a couple flights of stairs, and yet a significant minority have taken up running as a habit. Some have taken endurance to unfathomable extremes, like running the infamous 135-mile Badwater ultramarathon through Death Valley in July. Side note, I was quite proud of myself for running 12 miles. Not quite 135, but still felt good. Meanwhile, linguistic skill might be at historical peaks. More jobs require broader communication skills with more people than ever before. Most of us go to school for longer than even the most educated of the past, where we are taught writing and speaking in a more or less formal system. But things are different with shooting. The violent nature of shooting has always caused fearful people to seek prohibitions against others possessing ranged weapons. Most Western nations today ban or seriously restrict many types of firearms, and even some bows, like crossbows. For this reason, if there is something significantly human about shooting, it is in greater need of articulation and defense than speech or running. And there is something significantly human about shooting. Aside from its primitive role in hunting and combat, there is evidence that the act of shooting was critical in the development of human agency and consciousness. If this is true, then the loss of shooting, an aim often advanced by anxious safety advocates, risks not only a loss of connection with our past, but also with a deeper part of ourselves. The phenomenology of shooting. On paper, shooting is a relatively simple act. We raise our tool, perhaps a bow, perhaps a gun, and sight down our target. We release the string or pull the trigger. We feel the instrument act, and then, after some brief time interval, we see the hit or miss on our target. But more is going on in the act than meets the eye. Here we must take a moment to first distinguish between shooting and its far more ancient cousin, throwing. When walking through the woods, we may decide to throw a rock at a nearby object, perhaps a squirrel or the hornet nest next to our friend. The rock that we pick up is of uneven shape and unknown weight. We go by instinct, lobbing it as best we can with the arms nature gave us. Suppose we missed. Unlucky, we say to ourselves. It had to be a judgment call. We did not know the weight or shape of the rock in advance, having to judge how it would fly by feel. An easy thing to miscalculate. But suppose we decide to return to camp and get better. We collect 5 stones of near identical shape and weight. We practice, and our skill with one rock transfers to skill with the other rocks. We come to understand them. We figure out roughly where we have to aim to hit at different distances, and make our throw more consistent in power with practice. With this systematization, we have, imperceptibly but significantly, moved forward from merely throwing. What started as a desire to hit an object at a distance has begun to evolve into a system for hitting harder from further away and with greater precision. A sling permits tremendously increased power with the stone. A spear gives us a throwing missile, more damaging than a mere rock, and a tool like an atlatl provides power to the spear in the way a sling gives more power to a stone. But with a bowstring, which when drawn to the same spot on the cheek will release the same arrow at the same speed every time, we achieve an ability to hone our aim with power and precision mechanically unlike previous advancements. It is with the bow, perhaps, that we achieve shooting. Shooting is not instinctive in the same way as throwing. While instinctive shooting is certainly a style and approach that even modern archers still use, there's a difference in the equipment. Whether it is a stick bow or a precision rifle, the technology involved with shooting reduces variation. In other words, the shooter becomes responsible for the success or failure of the shot in a way that is controllable, in proportion to the precision of his tools. Of course, the stone thrower is also mechanically responsible for his hits and misses, but it is felt differently with shooting. Responsibility is something the shooter experiences as agency. The archer releases a bit early, and long before the arrow hits its target, he knows it will be short. A shooter anticipates the recoil of his pistol and pushes down before pulling the trigger. If he is experienced, he will recognize the movement and realize his fault. The understanding of failure is possible precisely because of the reliability of the system which we don't see with slings and tomahawks. Indeed, the earliest forms of agency must have taken baby steps in the smallest possible increments of time in experiencing one's own actions as causes. Now, I'm going to pause my reading here to go into some backstory. The inspiration of this essay came from listening to a lecture by Patrick Haggard on agency. Patrick Haggard is an English neuroscientist who studies agency, and he came up with this method for quantifying agency that he calls intention binding. And the method here is you have a subject in a room and they press a button, and after some short time interval, say 600 milliseconds, a tone is played. That's the baseline. That's the control. Now, prior to this experiment, and I should say, the subject then has to guess the amount of time that passed between the pressing of the button and the tone. So, maybe they guess it exactly. On average, maybe they're a little high or a little low. 700 milliseconds, 500. Where the experiment gets interesting is Patrick Haggard and his research team would put the subjects through other experiences that either prime them to experience higher states of agency or lower states of agency. So perhaps the subject is put in the context of a game, and it's a team game, and the teammates are perhaps collaborators with the experiment. And because of the actions of his teammate, the subject's team loses. So he's feeling kind of down because they lost this game, and it's not his fault. Like he suffered this loss and he didn't have control. So that experience perhaps puts him in a decreased state of agency, we might imagine. What they found is that when subjects are in decreased states of agency, when they press the button and hear the tone, the subjects tend to overestimate the time gap. So instead of, if it's 600 milliseconds, they might say 800 milliseconds or 900 milliseconds. On average, they will overestimate the time gap, which means the experience of time is related to one's agency. Did I cause this sound to happen by pressing the button? If they feel like pressing the button caused the sound, they will underestimate the time gap. They will perceive the cause and the effect more closely together. Whereas if they see themselves as having less agency, as having less of an effect in the world, and they perceive the two events as unrelated, time will dilate outward, and they'll perceive greater time. Very, very interesting stuff. So the importance of that is it highlights the importance of the perception of time in discussion of agency. And that brings us back to shooting and why shooting is so interesting, because unlike hitting a tree with an axe where the cause and the effect are simultaneous, I swing the axe, and as the axe hits the tree is hit by the axe. It's one act, really. But with a bow and arrow, there is a time gap. With a gun at sufficient distance, there's a time gap, a perceptible time gap. So, but when we're talking about the origins of consciousness, we're obviously talking about bows and arrows, not not primeval guns. Anyways, I'll reread that last sentence. Indeed, the earliest forms of agency must have taken baby steps in the smallest possible increments of time in experiencing one's own actions as causes. On this ground alone, shooting provides a setting which could explain how the experience of agency once arose in our species. Throwing may have laid the groundwork, but the systematized nature of shooting also provides an incentive for agency in a way that other activities do not. Those with higher agency and a greater sense of personal action will be more likely to hit over time, because when they miss, they are more likely to blame themselves than a god or some other force. They experience themselves as a cause and not merely as a conduit. Explaining the origin of agency would, by necessity, also explain the rise of consciousness. Agency is a subset of consciousness. Without consciousness, we would be like wolves or sharks, relying upon instinct and natural intelligence to hunt and survive. I should pause here as well to say, people can often conflate consciousness with intelligence. They are not the same thing. They're very much not the same thing. People can be very self-aware with not very high problem-solving ability or pattern recognition or processing speed, we might say. Conversely, someone can be highly intelligent and not particularly self-aware. Philosophers in the philosophy of mind like to talk about hypothetical beings called philosophical zombies, which are functional human beings, except they lack subjective experience entirely. Here we're not talking about subjective experience, but self-awareness, and we probably spend a fair amount of our day unself-aware, especially when we're in so-called flow states. So anyways, wanted to throw that in. Returning to the essay. When we speak of consciousness, we are speaking both of subjective sensation generally. Why is it like anything to exist? Oh, I'm about to clarify. And also of our awareness of this sensation, the experience of being you, which is sometimes called self-consciousness. When philosophers speak of the hard problem of consciousness, they are speaking of the former. This question is a metaphysical mystery. This basic sense may not be unique to humans, as philosopher Thomas Nagel famously argued. It is almost certainly like something to be a bat, whether we can see any evidence of that subjective experience or not. But what distinguishes humans and interests us here is the latter, self-aware sense of consciousness. This is both our recognition of ourselves in the mirror and our sense of agency in the world around us, that we can choose to make things happen. Without this, we could very well go through life on instinct and even having thoughts. Psychologist Julian Jaynes described the hypothetical pre-conscious man as a man living in a world of gods and spirits, where his own thoughts would arrive to him as if through the voice of an external source. With animals, we can recognize that they have a subjective experience, but lack this sense of agency. When owners punish their dogs, the dog does not have the same understanding of why they are being punished that we do. What we perceive as guilt is a projection of our own, and nothing more than the animal's foreboding that they are about to be punished for something. And over time they will learn what not to do by unconscious association. This experience of selfhood is by no means purely positive. Consciousness brings with it the possibilities of anxiety, despair, and self-pity. By itself, consciousness is taxing, and without a fruitful object of attention, self-awareness can be completely debilitating. Consciousness is justified if it is accompanied by some sense of agency, the experience of being a cause in our surroundings. With agency, consciousness is a tool of perception across time that permits us to act, to build, create, and strike in manners we could never have imagined as unconscious creatures. Without agency, consciousness only carries its costly, paralytic downsides. We might consider for evidence our current generation of adolescents and young adults who have been made hyper-aware of their own identity and consciousness, perhaps in relation to any number of quickly multiplying causes that activists are persistently trying to raise awareness about. This population suffers some of the worst mental health in recorded history, with prescription medications for anxiety and depression that may not be sufficient to deal with the heightened consciousness we have managed to achieve of things we can do nothing about. But with the immense power of shooting, the reward for consciousness might have begun to outweigh the costs. It may be beyond our ability to prove where consciousness came from, let alone shooting as a specific origin, but the connection between shooting and consciousness in our experience and in our language and stories should make the hypothesis at least plausible. But perhaps more importantly, it establishes the connection, regardless of origin. Shooting has always been connected metaphorically to consciousness, and we can see this in our myths and our very language. Morality versus virtue. Shooting as the origin of sin. there's a kind of moral judgment inherent in the experience of shooting. The success or failure of a shot rests upon the shooter because systematization accounts for everything else. He is praiseworthy if he hits, and blameworthy if he misses. A man might be attractive for his gifts, like his height, natural strength, or inborn intelligence. These positive qualities are virtues, or excellences, and are respected as valuable whether he is responsible for them or not. Throwing might be considered among these kinds of virtue. We don't hold it against men morally for lacking certain gifts, even if we maintain a preference for virtuous company. Morality is different from virtue. To be moral implies agency and an ability to have done otherwise. To judge someone morally is to judge their actions and their choice, not their nature, and to distinguish their actions from their nature. To judge others morally is to ascribe agency to them. To judge ourselves morally is to ascribe agency to ourselves, and to experience that agency in our own judgment. Virtue can be possessed by unconscious men, and even detected unconsciously, while morality requires consciousness. Wouldn't it be interesting if our earliest moral language, as distinct from virtue language, corresponds with shooting? Indeed, this is exactly what we find, and in disparate cultures, too. One of the key words that distinguishes morality from virtue has its etymological roots in shooting. In the religious history of the West, our use of the word sin has etymological roots in Proto-Germanic sundio, or perhaps Old Norse sanner, or Latin sons, all variously translate as guilty. But sin came into common use as a translation from Christian texts, which used the Hebrew hata and Greek hamartia as their foundation. The words mean to miss and to miss the mark, respectively. We find the same etymology in the root for sin in the Sanskrit aparad. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Aparad. Colloquially understood, it means to offend, wrong, or sin, but literally translates as missing the mark. To the ancients, the very idea of sin, with all of its cosmic and spiritual significance, was best understood and articulated in reference to our ability to hit a target. A sinful man is the man who, due to some moral flaw, and not merely a deficiency in virtue, failed in the act of shooting. There is reason to suspect Greek and Sanskrit may have shared a common root in the Proto-Indo-European language family. That's pretty well confirmed. But Hebrew comes from a different linguistic group, meaning there are possibly two independent linguistic origins for the same concept of sin as a moral failing, expressed through the language of archery. To the degree that shooting formed the origins of consciousness and agency, this language would not have been metaphorical, but literal, and the experience of moral failing would have been felt first in the activity of shooting, and only then extended outward into other domains of human life. Beyond the words for sin, we find a connection between consciousness and shooting in ancient myths, namely in the characters of Rama, Arjuna, Odysseus, and Apollo. Archery also holds an important status in the great epics of the Indian subcontinent. Might have to fix that. To fight with a bow and arrow is traditionally considered most excellent and is the weapon of choice for two of the most important figures in Hindu mythology. The first is the warrior prince Rama, the principal figure of the Ramayana, and the second is Arjuna, a main protagonist of the Mahabharata, and the primary figure of its well-known portion known as the Bhagavad Gita. Subsection Rama. The most famous incident involving Rama and a bow takes place in the first chapter of the Ramayana and details the winning of his bride Sita. Janaka, the king of Videha, was plowing a field in preparation for a fire sacrifice, and a girl sprang up from behind his plow. Quote, "Now, once as I was plowing a field, a girl sprang up from behind my plow. I found her as I was clearing the field, and she is thus known by the name Sita, furrow. Sprung from the earth, she has been raised as my daughter, and since she was not born from the womb, my daughter has been set apart as one for whom the only bride price is strength." End quote. The test would be the stringing of the god Shiva's bow, a family heirloom kept in an 8-wheeled iron chest, said to require 5,000 men to haul. Many kings asked for the hand of Sita, but none could even grasp the bow, let alone lift it or string it. Janaka saw them as weak and refused to allow any of them to marry Sita. The kings became angry, believing their failures would bring them disrepute, and laid siege on the capital for a year, exhausting the resources of the kingdom. King Janaka did penance and was given a large army from the gods to drive away the suitors. They were routed in retreat while being slaughtered. So, we'll come back to suitors and bows in the Odysseus story. One day, the great sage Vishvamitra, along with Rama and his brother Lakshman, came to visit King Janaka. There was an offer to show the bow to Rama. Quote, Rama opened the chest in which the bow lay, and regarding it closely, he then spoke, "Now, Brahman, I shall touch this great bow with my hand. I shall attempt to lift and even to string it." "Very well," replied both the king and the sage. So, following the sage's instructions, he easily grasped the bow in the middle. Then, as though it were a mere play to him, the righteous prince, the delight of the Raghus, strung the bow as thousands watched. The mighty man affixed the bowstring, and, knocking an arrow to it, drew it back. But in doing so, the best of men broke the bow in the middle. End quote. The text describes a thundering noise and trembling of the earth at the breaking of the bow that causes everyone in attendance to fall except the king, the sage, Rama, and his brother. With the bride price fulfilled, Janaka joyfully offers Sita in marriage. The bow is not only a symbol of Rama's great strength, it is a symbol of his morality, virtue, and divine origin. A divine origin as the 7th incarnation, or avatar, of Lord Vishnu, the source of absolute consciousness and therefore agency. The inability of the suitor kings to string the bow and their subsequent behaviors show their lack of morality, a wickedness, papkarna. Or papkarna. It is noteworthy that in this story, moral goodness, and the agency that distinguishes morality from mere excellence, is a requirement to even lift the bow, which has become magnified into enormous proportions. The symbolic transfer unites morality with the act of shooting, and perhaps transforms shooting into a metaphor for action itself, just as missing the mark became an expression describing moral failure in general. Arjuna. Arjuna was known as the greatest of all warriors and archers, yet a pivotal moment involving the bow for him is in stark contrast to the previously detailed story from the Ramayana. The Kurukshetra War is the central battle that takes place within the epic poem the Mahabharata. The war is the result of a struggle for succession between two groups of cousins in the Kuru dynasty, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. As the two armies gather, the Pandava prince Arjuna asks his charioteer, Krishna, to take him to the center of the battlefield to observe the assembled armies. He sees among them his own relatives, respected teachers and friends. He becomes filled with doubt at the prospect of killing them and contemplates leaving the battlefield. He turns to Krishna and pleads with him to tell him what is the right thing to do. The discourse that takes place between Krishna and Arjuna is known as the Bhagavad Gita, or Song of God. Side note, I do recommend people read that. It's a phenomenal story. It comes across very much like the voice from the whirlwind in Job, for those who are familiar with that bit of Old Testament poetry. It's the God emerging and revealing himself and speaking, profound wisdom of the mysteries and of life and existence and doing your duty and so forth. Chapter 1 of the Gita is often referred to as Arjuna Vishada Yoga, the yoga of Arjuna's sorrow. The language in verse 46 describes Arjuna's anguish as Soka Samvigna Manasa, his mind, quote, distracted and agitated by sorrow. Arjuna rationalizes announces that his desire not to cause harm is a moral duty that shows discretion and compassion. He goes so far as to say it would be better if he himself were to be killed unarmed on the battlefield. He throws aside his bow and arrow and sits down on the chariot engulfed in grief. But Krishna admonishes Arjuna not to give in to impotence. He tells him that his state of mind is not true compassion or discretion, but ksudram hridaya darbalyam. I apologize, Ed. I'm sure I mispronounced that. But the translation is petty lamentation and delusion. Weakness at such a crucial time does not befit his status as a kshatriya, a member of the warrior class or caste. It will neither enhance his reputation nor lead to the heavenly planets. It will lead to infamy. Krishna urges him to arise and do battle. He has a choice, and putting down the bow and choosing not to fight would be immoral, the epitome of sin. The battlefield of Kurukshetra is also known as Dharma Kshetra, the field of duty, which means the mythic landscape of the Bhagavad Gita paints taking up the bow as the central representation of moral duty. The fulfillment of Arjuna's duty, dharma, rests in his ability to shoot with one-pointed consciousness, ekagrata, in full absorption and undisturbed attention. So, we have the Indic subcontinent with shooting and morality and moral virtue there. Odysseus. The Iliad is a book of fate, framed at its very outset with the idea that the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. By contrast, the Odyssey is a book of agency, and Homer describes even the gods, including fate-sealing Zeus, ascribing agency to mortals below. Quote, "Ah, how shameless the way these mortals blame the gods. From us alone, they say, come all their miseries, yes, but they themselves, with their own reckless ways, compound their pains beyond their proper share." In the Odyssey, consciousness is Odysseus's superpower. He is the man of mind, or consciousness, of nous. In the opening, theme-setting lines of the book, it is said that he, quote, saw, quote, many cities of men, and learned to know their minds. And here the word minds is nous. In juxtaposition with the glory, or kleos, of Achilles, Odysseus stands as a kind of narrative embodiment and symbol of consciousness in the world of Homer. This consciousness is ultimately manifested in the famous scene in the dining hall of Ithaca. Penelope has laid out a challenge for the suitors with the promise that she will marry the winner. The challenge being to string her husband's bow and shoot through a series of axe heads. After all of the suitors failed to even string Odysseus' great bow, just like the story of Rama, Odysseus, disguised as an old man, strings the bow with ease and shoots through the axe heads, before turning and dispatching the suitors with the same weapon. Also like the story of Rama. The suitors' failure to recognize the true king is thematically indicative of their unconsciousness, like Odysseus' comrades, who could not be saved because of their own recklessness. They are nepioi, literally children, sometimes translated as disconnected or fools. It's basically the opposite of nous. Their failure to utilize the bow represents sin and moral failure of character. Again, it is the bow which is associated with moral excellence, or sin. Apollo. Elsewhere in the Hellenic world, we can see this connection between morality, consciousness, and shooting in the gods themselves, in one god in particular. Apollo, he who shoots from afar, is also the god of morality. It is the moral failings of Agamemnon in relation to Apollo that begins the drama of the story of the Iliad, and it is Apollo who punishes the hubris of Agamemnon, arrows for tears. While other deities like Zeus dictate certain customs of hospitality and Athena of civic relations, it is Apollo who enjoins his followers to a decidedly internal ethic, morality as distinct from virtue. It is only, or custom, it is only through this conscious self-perception that virtues such as moderation and self-knowledge become possible as moral virtues. And here's a quote from Nietzsche. Quote, "This apotheosis of individuation, if it be at all conceived as imperative and laying down precepts, knows but one law, the individual, i.e., the observance of the boundaries of the individual. Measured in the Hellenic sense. Apollo, as ethical deity, demands due proportion of his disciples, and that this may be observed, he demands self-knowledge. And thus, parallel to the aesthetic necessity for beauty, there run the demands, know thyself and not too much." End quote. And that is from The Birth of Tragedy. Apollo is many things, but he is not all things. His joining of archery and the morality of consciousness is a unique connection among that wide-ranging pantheon of complex deities, not merely chance. His very character evokes in golden solar imagery the origins of consciousness and morality itself in the striker, in the one who shoots from afar. Shooting and consciousness. On the etymological, mythical, and phenomenological evidence, there is reason to believe that shooting gave birth to agency and its twin, consciousness. That consciousness, in turn, gave birth to morality, as distinct from virtue, and together these changes reshaped and enshrined themselves in the language and myth of humanity, wrapping themselves in the characters and even the very words of the technical means that created them. This hypothesis seems more plausible than consciousness emerging from mere complexity, or arising out of the collapse of bicameralism. But regardless of where consciousness arose from, these stories and words, as well as our own experience, show a profound connection between shooting and consciousness, one that can tell us much about ourselves both in the past and the present. Our abilities as endurance animals and speakers are important and species-defining, and a connection with these is usually understood to be important both for our physical and psychological health. Perhaps there is a spiritual dimension too, in terms of connecting with our primordial ancestors and the highest skills we have inherited from nature. But these stories show that shooting is important as well, to a similar degree as speech or running. Shooting is fundamental to our humanity, more so even than consciousness itself. And that's the conclusion of our essay. I was very, very happy to write that. Took a while of research, a whole lot of editing. But for all of that, we actually took a whole lot out. And there's a whole lot to say here, especially in the dimension of there being a proper object of consciousness. One thing I would like to throw out as just something to think about. It's very common, especially in utilitarian circles and in any school of thought or religion that descends from Hegelianism at all, to deify consciousness. And you notice this a lot in the realm of AI research, which we have been reading about a lot in the last, several months, as ChatGPT and Bard and other programs begin to take off. Everyone's asking, are these things conscious? Are they self-aware? What I think is most interesting about this hypothesis is that if consciousness did come from shooting, it really puts consciousness in its place. It's an interesting and valuable tool, but maybe not as amazing and important as we think it is. People will sometimes say, "Oh, you got to let go of your ego," and there's a million half ways to interpret that, and some of them are good and useful, and others of them are bad and totally useless. But maybe the most useful way of putting it is the way, the combination of classical Greek and Indic texts with modern pop culture, but the way Eminem talks about it when he says, you've got to lose yourself in the moment. in his like famous 8 Mile rap, about not choking on. He's talking about not being self-conscious. It also comes out in Maverick in Top Gun, saying when you're up there dogfighting, you can't think. If you think, you're dead. Also very important. Consciousness is not, it is an amazing thing, but this kind of consciousness, this kind of self-awareness is not necessarily something to deify. It's not the universe coming to know itself as God and its own creator, or whatever, Hegel is trying to do with history, which is just advanced Hellenic heroism. Anyways, it's something that's easy to overstate. And I think people, just as people sort of overestimate the importance of socialization when it comes to education, and they neglect Uncle Ted's much underrated concept of over-socialization. Not to endorse that, we went over that in the anarcho-primitivism essay, or podcast. But it is easy to lose sight of the flip side of many of these subjects. And I think the idea that consciousness is maybe not as important and as like supremely valuable in our understanding of morality and our understanding of being a good person and living a good life is an interesting thing to think about, and perhaps something to explore in the future. So I hope this essay has given you something to think about and has been enjoyable to listen to. Hopefully there'll be more stuff in this subject matter coming in the future. So anyways, thanks so much for listening, and take care.